I mean, here's the thing, man. Like everything was written down, man. If you just read the things that were written by PNAC and the neoconservatives, um, it's not like they were secretive about what they wanted and what their plans were and what they wanted to do with the Middle East and what their goals were with the military and what they were trying to achieve. It's not it. They wrote it down. So it's not like people are making up some crazy conspiracy. So it's not a surprise they wanted to extend that war to Iraq.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And when you talk about, the Project for a New American Century, that doctrine that they outlay in rebuilding America's defenses, it's the same doctrine that they put in the Defense Planning Guidance in 1992, which was the official Pentagon plan for American dominance. And then that became the national security strategy of the United States in 2002 under W. Bush. It became the official national security strategy. And you're right, they couldn't be more clear about it. The policy is complete and total American military dominance forever. And in order to keep the peace in the world, we are going to prevent any power or group of powers from ever even being able to consider the idea that they would challenge America's military dominance in their country, on their continent, in their region, their hemisphere, on Earth. That's it. We win. Don't even try it. And that's how we're going to lord it over everybody. And then, so part of the Middle Eastern doctrine, if you exclude, Likud party interests for the moment, the American interest in dominating the Middle East, it's not so much about stealing that oil for the money, although Exxon and their friends get to make a pretty penny. But it's
Well, that's important because that's
strategic
the left wing
dominance.
narrative on that's the anti-war
Right.
left in the early 2000s. That was the narrative. I think that's why so many people were turned off from it. Like, oh well, we could
War for
shut up.
oil,
It's
war
not for
for
oil.
oil.
So I think
Right.
I think that messaging wasn't correct.
But see, the thing of it is, like, it's a pretty powerful optical illusion. There's a hell of a lot of oil and a hell of a lot of money in that region. So the conflicts of interest are legion. But no, you're right. I mean, the reality is the primary reason for that war was because of the Likud party interests and therefore the neoconservatives' interests in the United States to, attempt to create a friendly situation that would guarantee Israeli dominance. But as far as the oil goes, it's not so much about stealing the money as it is about being able to lord it over East Asia, being able to lord it over our frenemies, the Chinese, for the event, as though the U.S. Navy can't just shut down all shipping anywhere in the world that they feel like anyway. But this is the thinking, is that this is this important choke point. And so in the event of a conflict with China, we can lord it over them. But even in peacetime, we can lord it over them, but also our friends, the Indians, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, the Indonesians. All these people are running off of Middle Eastern oil. And so if we're the dominant force in the Middle East, that, helps to prop up our policy of dominance throughout the world. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing of it. It's when they say full spectrum dominance, that's what they're talking about. They want the government in Turkmenistan to have to think, oh, well, what are the Americans going to say about whatever it is that they do? Same thing in Outer Mongolia. Same thing everywhere, with no exceptions. It's got to be, every river and every stream and every, sea on the planet has to be considered American property and all the land in between. So
I feel like the
that's,
U.S. would try to dominate the sun if we all started moving to like solar energy or something like that.
yeah, seriously. Or like the moon. Like you couldn't really count on these guys to say, hey, like let's all have really cool paper agreements to have like, international control and no, single nations, claim on the moon. Um, I could see them fighting a war over it. I could see them fighting a war on the damn moon, trying to keep other nation states off of it or whatever, instead of figuring out a better way to work it out. And what a great way to waste money on that. You know what I mean? To
Reminds me of the show on Apple TV For All Mankind. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
no.
It's an alternate history show where the Soviets beat us to the moon,
Oh,
and
uh-huh.
yeah, it's super interesting, very fascinating. I think you'd like it. But in the later seasons, they're all on the moon, and let's just say some conflict happens.
Yeah, I
and
bet.
we shot first. Spoiler
Right.
alert.
Yeah, always. Yeah, no. So, and then look, let's talk about the Israeli angle here. It's not a coincidence that the neoconservatives are all hardcore Zionists, and they're not all Jewish, but they are all very, very Zionist. And their movement essentially comes from the radical left. Most of them were Trotskyite communists who then sided with America in the Cold War because they were Americans and because the Stalinists beat the Trotskyites for control of the USSR. So that was convenient for them. But then they moved to the right because of Vietnam and civil rights. And they didn't want anything to do with the new left anti-war movement or the pro-black civil rights movement of the 1960s. So they started moving to the right. And they essentially, the generation was shifting here too. But these are the people who populated the National Review and Commentary magazine, and who studied under Leo Strauss, and then went and worked for Scoop Jackson, who was the senator from Boeing. They called him the senator from Washington State. And then they became Reaganites. And a bunch of them, went to work for Ronald Reagan. And, they essentially moved to the right in the 1970s. And then so you have, this major kind of effort to ally with the military-industrial complex and to take over the major foundations. So the Bradley, Olin, and Scaife foundations were really important. And in, I guess, the early 1990s, they founded the Weekly Standard magazine to go along with the National Review. And, essentially, so you have, by the time of the W. Bush years, by the time of the Bush senior years, these guys are essentially excluded from Middle East policy. And Bush Sr. had, Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor. His job is said to have been to keep the crazies in the basement, which meant that they're allowed to kill people in Latin America, but they're not allowed to mess with Middle Eastern policy, keep them away from Middle Eastern policy. So that's why you hear about Elliot Abrams and all these guys being caught up in Iran-Contra. It's because they were being kept away from Israel and Middle Eastern issues. But then, so W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld hire them all. So when you talk about rebuilding America's defenses, or you mentioned PNAC, and that was their big, study that they put out. They had all these.
It's a very creepy paper.
Yeah,
they have some very creepy stuff about like targeting people by genome and stuff like that. It's very weird.
Well, I mean, they're essentially bringing that up as a scare story of something we have to defend against.
Yeah.
Is the context there, but it's they're throwing all the spaghetti at the wall to say, this is why we need to increase American defense spending. And you could look at it as nothing but a brochure for Lockheed products. They made their this massive alliance with Bruce Jackson from Lockheed, who also helped to finance the Weekly Standard and to help finance PNAC and also the Committee for NATO Expansion and later the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq. And the guy was clearly just selling airplanes. I mean, the whole thing was just essentially a ruse from their point of view. But then there are some key members of the neoconservative movement in the 1990s, Richard Pearl and David Wormser and Douglas Feith, who wrote this paper for Benjamin Netanyahu when he was first becoming the prime minister the first time in 1996. And it's called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And there's two follow-ups, Coping with Crumbling States, and then the book, Tyranny's Ally. And they all say the same thing, essentially. And the idea is this. And it's completely crazy. So if it sounds crazy to you, that's because it's crazy, okay? It might even be a little confusing, but try to picture the map of the Middle East here and the way it's all set up. Their theory was, if we overthrow Saddam Hussein, then Jordan will take over Baghdad. And the king of Jordan, he's the Hashemite king, he will take over, or his cousin, they shifted the way that they talked about it, would become the king of the Iraqis. And it'd be great.
That is just such an insane thing. The Shias don't even recognize the Hashemites as the stewards of Mecca. Like they are not that.
Yeah, but that's exactly the point.
Between the Sunnis and Shia had to do with the the lineage of Muhammad.
Right. But that's exactly
But
the
how did
point.
they not know that?
Well, because
Or
what
they
they did was,
willfully.
yeah, no, they knew it, but they got it all mixed up, right? And what happened was it was Ahmed Chalabi who told them that, yeah, no, see, don't worry. The Shiites love bending over and taking orders from anyone who claims to have the blood of Muhammad. And Wormser didn't understand the difference. That no, the Shiites revere, certain family lines from Muhammad, but not anyone who claims to be descended from Muhammad, and certainly not the Hashemites. And in fact, when the Hashemite king had been foisted on them by the British in a previous era, the Shiite clergy had issued a fatwa against him and forbidding any Iraqi from cooperating with the government, and which helped lead to his downfall. So, in other words, you are totally right to object right off the bat that, yeah, but Scott, in Iraq, the Shiites are the super majority. What's going to happen with that? Yeah, exactly. Except these guys are idiots, Henry. And so they didn't come up with that objection at all. Ahmed Chalabi said, don't worry. What'll happen is the Shiites will do whatever they're told. And what we'll do then is, and here's where it gets, really ridiculous. What we'll do is we'll have our new Hashemite king will instruct the Shiite clergy in Najaf to instruct Hezbollah in Lebanon to stop being friends with Iran, to start being friends with Israel. And then Turkey and Jordan and Israel will be dominant, and Syria and Hezbollah will be tamed, and Syria will be left out in the cold, and Iran isolated on the far eastern periphery of the region there. Now, this is completely stupid and crazy and wrong, but this is what these extremely important neoconservatives have let themselves be convinced of by Chalabi. So obviously Bush wanted to do it, right? Rumsfeld wanted to do it. Cheney wanted to do it. But then they all turned to Wolfowitz, and Wolfowitz says, yeah, we game this out. It's going to be great. Trust us eggheads. We already went through how it's going to shake out in the new Iraqi order, and it's going to be wonderful. We got it all figured out. So Bush didn't trouble himself with these kinds of questions. That's what neocons are for, but they're complete idiots. And the idea was that they're so smart. Oh, Paul Wolfowitz. Why, one time he predicted that Saddam Hussein would do something that Saddam Hussein did, which I think would have been his invasion of Iran, which America gave him the green light to do. So, yeah, big prediction, dude. But wow, what a brilliant genius. That means we got to let this guy decide whatever he wants. He's so damn smart. And then you guys know how that is from your, dealing with people in your real life, that anybody who's that smart is not that smart. And they're always going to be overlooking something. And you could have, a real dummy who's got some real compelling wisdom on really important things. And a guy like Paul Wolfowitz is the kind of guy who would make the worst decisions in American foreign policy history, right? In terms of even from the empire's own point of view of what they were trying to accomplish. He ran the car into the ditch. The guy's a complete, failure and loser. But they looked at him and said, wow, well, if you guys say so, then this is going to be great. Let's do it. And then, of course, it didn't work out like that at all. What happened instead was that Bush put Iran's best friends in power. It was the Shiites, all right. They weren't taking orders. I mean, in fact, let me ask you, have you ever heard anything about the history of Iraq War II, where the Jordanians were dominant or even had a say at all in anything that happened in Iraq War II, right? Nothing. They had no influence whatsoever. And look, it was Ahmed Chalabi, who was working for himself first and Iran second, and who conned these guys. And I have the quote in the book where he says, look, I just had to tell these guys what they needed to hear to get the war. Don't worry about me. I'm with you guys still. That was him talking to his friends. Don't worry, I'm just manipulating these idiots. And so that's how it happened. And then this explains then the rest of American policy in the Middle East since then too. Because if what Bush did by invading that country, starting that war, was put Iran's best friends in power, where they remain to this day, well, then shit. That's not what they wanted to happen. So now what are they going to do? So then that explains why they're back on the side of the terrorists, as I explained earlier, where most of the time they're on the same side as the bin Ladenites nowadays. Well, that's why. They're trying to get revenge against the Shiites because they're mad that they fought Iraq War II for them.